Hannah Mercer married a man she had never met on the strength of a year of letters. And the man who met her train was not the man who had written a single word of them. She just would not learn that for 4 more years. And by then, she would have to decide whether a love was a real thing if the right man had only ever spoken it in another man's mouth. Spring of 1884. The train from Omaha came down the long grade into Lodgepole, Wyoming territory, an hour behind its own schedule. And Hannah pressed her face to the cold glass and counted fence posts because counting was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. She was 24. She had a leather valise on her knees, a folded letter inside it worn soft as cloth at the creases, and a wedding planned for the following morning to a man named Royce Vance, whose words she had read by lamplight for a year until she knew the shape of his sentences better than she knew her own face. She had crossed 2 territories for those sentences. She had sold her mother's sewing machine and her own good winter coat for the fair. A woman did not do that for a stranger. She did it for a voice on a page that had told her, in a plain, careful hand, that he was tired of being alone and believed she was the answer. The platform at Lodgepole was a strip of gray planks under a sky going honey gold. And there were 2 men on it when she stepped down, and she knew at once which one was hers because he was already smiling. Royce Vance was lean and clean-shaven, dark hair slicked back under a flat black hat, and he came across the planks with both hands out and his easy grin already working. "You're prettier than your letters let on," he said, and the whole platform seemed to warm to him, every face on the planks tilting toward his grin like a cold room tilting toward a lit lamp. Behind him stood a second man, older, broad through the shoulders, a short dark beard and a worn tan hat pulled low, and that one did not smile and did not speak. He only stepped past her, lifted her heavy trunk to his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and carried it to the wagon while his brother held both her hands and told her how long he had waited. "My brother Caleb," Royce said when he remembered to, tipping his head at the broad man loading the wagon. "He doesn't say much. Don't take it personal." Hannah looked at the quiet brother, and the quiet brother looked back at her one time, a long, steady look out of tired gray-blue eyes. And then he looked away as if he had been caught at something and turned the team toward the ranch. She thought nothing of it. She was a woman who had just arrived at the end of a year of hoping, and the man doing the hoping with her was holding her hands and saying her name like he'd practiced it, and the folded letter in her valise had told her this was where her life began. The Vance Ranch sat 8 miles south in a dry valley, a weathered timber house and a sagging fence line and a barn that leaned a little toward the west wind. Royce talked the whole way out about the cattle, about the herd they'd build, about the children they'd have, and the porch he'd add. And Caleb drove and said nothing, and the dust rose gold behind the wagon wheels. That night, Hannah took the folded letter out of her valise and read it one more time by the light of a kerosene lamp, the way she had read it on every leg of the journey, and the words were as steady and kind as they had ever been. "I am not a man of many speeches," it said, "but I will keep you warm, and I will not lie to you, and that is more than charm." She fell asleep believing the man who had written that was sleeping under the same roof. She was right. She just had the wrong room. If you've ever watched the wrong person take all the credit for something good and quiet and true, watched the loud one take the bow while the one who actually did the work stood at the back of the room and never said a word, then you already know the ache this story is built on, and you belong here. This channel is for the people the world reads wrong in the first minute, the ones whose worth gets handed to somebody louder. Take a moment and subscribe, because the quiet ones get their due here. Even when it takes 4 winters and a board pried up off a cold floor. And that is the only kind of story I tell. They were married the next morning in the little whitewashed church in Lodgepole, with Reverend Hollis reading the words and a handful of townsfolk in the pews. And Royce said his vows loud and sure and grinning, and at the back of the church the quiet brother stood alone with his hat in his hands and watched the floor. Hannah remembered that later, how Caleb had not come up to the front, how he had stayed at the very back like a man who did not belong at his own brother's wedding. At the time she thought he was only shy. She had no way of knowing that the man at the back of the church was the man who had written every word that brought her there, or that, when he shouldered her trunk that day, he had carried it like a man handling something he had already signed over to somebody else. Married life with Royce Vance was a bright, restless, charming thing for about a season, and then it began to thin. He was good company at a supper table and useless at a fence line. He could make the whole town of Lodgepole laugh on a Saturday and could not be found on a Monday when the calves were dropping. He had debts Hannah did not know about, and a fondness for the card tables in town that she learned about slowly, the slow way a house tells you it has a draft. First, the cold finds you, and only later do you find the crack it comes through. The letters had promised her a steady man. The man she had married was a lit match, all flare and no fire that lasted, and she lay awake some nights in the cold end of the house and could not understand how the hand that wrote those calm, careful sentences belonged to a man who could not sit still for the length of a prayer. It was Caleb who kept the ranch alive. Hannah saw it without quite letting herself see it. While Royce rode to town, the quiet brother was out before light, mending the wire, doctoring the sick stock, splitting the wood she cooked over. He spoke to her rarely and never long, a word about the weather, a question about whether the stove was drawing right. But the wood box by her stove was always full, and she never once filled it herself, and she never saw him do it. He left before she woke. He moved through the place like a man trying to take up as little room in her life as he could manage, and for a long time she mistook that for coldness. Once, when a colt went down lame and Royce cursed it and walked off to saddle a sound horse, Hannah watched Caleb kneel in the cold mud of the corral for the better part of an hour, with that colt's hoof cradled in his lap, working slow, talking to it under his breath in a low, even voice she could not quite hear. The colt that would not stand for anyone stood quiet for him. She filed that away without knowing she was filing it. The animals on that place leaned toward the quiet brother and shied from the loud one. And an animal, her mother used to say, is a poor liar and a fair judge of a man. There was the morning, too, that she came on him in the barn before dawn, mending the strap of her own valise where it had frayed on the journey out, stitching it careful by lantern light when he thought no one would know. And when he heard her step, he set it down quick and busied himself with something else, embarrassed as a man caught at a kindness he never meant to be seen doing. Sue Tatum, the widow from the next ranch over, set her straight one afternoon over a covered dish of beans. "That older Vance boy," Sue said, plain as a fence post, "is the best man in this county and the worst at letting anyone know it." Hannah said she supposed he was steady. Sue gave her a long look and said steady was a word folks used when they hadn't looked close enough yet. And that a woman who'd married one Vance ought to be careful she hadn't gone and lost her heart to the other without anybody, herself included, ever saying it out loud. The first hard winter came down on them in their third year, and it came down mean. Snow drifted sideways in white threads across the yard and piled against the north wall of the barn until the door wouldn't swing, and the wind found every seam in the old timber house and laid a thin, cold blade of air along the floor of the room where Hannah slept. The cattle bunched and bawled in the drifts, and Royce was in Lodgepole and stayed there 4 days because the roads were bad. Or so he said. It was Caleb who broke ice on the water tank from dark to dark, his beard gone white with frost and his gloves frozen stiff. And Caleb who came wading back through the storm at midnight with a half-dead calf slung across his shoulders like a sack of meal. He pulled 2 of them out of a drift that week and carried them into Hannah's kitchen to thaw by the stove because there was nowhere warmer on the whole place. She remembered standing in the lamplight at 2 in the morning, the 2 of them kneeling on the plank floor rubbing life back into a shivering calf with grain sacks, the steam rising off its wet hide, neither of them saying a word, and how she had looked across at the quiet man's bent head and the frost still melting in his beard, and felt something move in her that she had no right to feel about her husband's brother. She put it away. She was a married woman. But the wood box by her stove was full again in the morning, the way it always was, and a married woman notices, in the end, whose hands keep her warm and whose hands are never there. The money trouble came to a head that same winter. A cattleman named Dunmore held the note on the Vance ranch. A silver-haired man in a black frock coat who could say the word foreclosure with the same idle smile other men kept for talk about the weather. And Royce had let the payments slip, had gambled against them, had signed things he should not have signed. Dunmore rode out one cold afternoon with 2 men behind him and a folded legal paper in his glove, and told Hannah, pleasantly, that the Vance place would be his by spring unless the back debt was made good, and that he'd be sorry to see a pretty woman put out in the snow. But business was business. Royce, when he finally came home, swore it would come right, swore he had a plan, swore it all loud and certain and empty, which was the only register Royce had. Hannah sat up that night with the ranch ledger open on the kitchen table and a hand pressed to her mouth. And the figures said what Royce would not. They were going to lose everything, and the man who had promised in writing to keep her warm could not even keep a roof over her head. It was old Pruitt who sent her under the floor. The frail, white-haired hand who had worked the Vance place since before either brother was grown, leaned on the barn rail one gray morning and told her, in his roundabout way, that the older boy kept his savings hid, always had, didn't trust banks, kept a tin under a board in the bunkhouse where he slept. "Won't tell you himself," Pruitt said. "Too proud. But it's there, and you got a right to know it, the way things stand." Hannah waited until the men were out on the range, and she went into the cold bunk room where Caleb slept apart from the house, and she found the loose board Pruitt meant, and she pried it up with a flat iron bar. There was a dented tin underneath, wrapped twice around with a frayed leather cord. She thought she was looking for money to save the ranch. She was about to find something that would take the ground out from under her entirely. Inside the tin there was a little money, folded careful, more than she'd hoped and not enough to matter. And underneath the money there were letters. Her letters. Every letter Hannah had ever written West, the ones she'd thought she was writing to Royce, every single one. Soft at the folds from being read and read again, tied in a bundle and kept like something holy. And beneath her letters, at the very bottom of the tin, there was one more. A single sheet, folded small, never sent. She opened it with hands gone strange and slow, and she read it in the cold lamplight, and the handwriting on it was a plain, careful, steady hand she would have known anywhere. Because it was the hand from every letter she had fallen in love with. It was not Royce's loose, looping scrawl. It never had been. The words that brought her across 2 territories, the calm voice that said, "I am not a man of many speeches, but I will keep you warm, and I will not lie to you," had been written by the quiet brother at the back of the church. Royce had answered her first letter on a dare, for a laugh, because a dare and a laugh were the whole of what he ever brought to anything. And when the strange woman in the next territory had written back, he had handed the whole business to his older brother and told him to keep the girl writing. And Caleb had. Caleb had written to her for a year, had fallen in love with her on paper, had told her the truth of himself in every line. And then Royce had gone down to the platform and put his hands out and let her marry the wrong brother. And Caleb had carried her trunk and said nothing and slept in the bunkhouse for 4 years with her letters under the floor. Hannah sat back against the cold bunk with the unsent letter in her lap and could not breathe right. Everything she had loved was real. None of it belonged to the man whose name she wore. The steadiness she'd crossed the country for was 8 feet away every night, splitting her wood, breaking her ice, keeping a wood box full for a woman who'd married his brother, and he had never once said a word, because the word would have cost his brother a wife and cost her the comfort of a settled life. And Caleb Vance was the kind of man who would rather carry a thing alone than set it down on someone he loved. She did not confront Royce. There was nothing in Royce to confront. He had told a lie the size of a marriage and would only have grinned at it. She waited 2 days until she could trust her own voice. And then on the 3rd evening she set the unsent letter on the kitchen table, still folded small and tight in its private creases. And when Caleb came in cold from the range, she pushed it across the wood toward him and asked him whose handwriting it was. The quiet brother looked at the letter on the table for a long moment. He took his hat off slow. And he did not lie to her because the man on the page had promised her he never would, and the man at the table was the same man. "Mine," he said. That was all. One word, and like everything Caleb gave it, came quiet and complete, and 4 years too late. What he told her then, in the longest string of sentences she'd ever heard out of him, was simple and terrible. Royce had thought it a fine joke. Caleb had meant to confess it before the wedding, had stood at the back of that church with the words in his mouth, and had not been able to ruin her arrival and his brother's happiness with the truth in the same breath. So he had decided to keep her warm the only way left to him, not as a husband, which he could never be, but as the man who filled the wood box and broke the ice and pulled her calves from the drifts and asked for nothing back. "I figured," he said, looking at his own hands, "if I couldn't be the man you came for, I could at least be the one who made sure you didn't freeze." Hannah understood then that she had been loved, plainly and completely, every single day for 4 years, by a man who had never once let her see the bill. The end of the Vance marriage came without a fight, which is how the worst endings tend to arrive, quietly, with the door already open. Hannah went to Royce and told him she knew about the letters, knew whose words had courted her, knew the joke he'd made of her whole life. And Royce, to his small credit, did not pretend. He laughed once, short and ashamed, and he said he'd always meant to tell her, and they both knew that was the last lie. He could not save the ranch. He did not even want it. Within the month, he signed his half of the Vance place over to settle what he could of his own debts and rode out east toward a card game with a bigger table. And Hannah watched him go from the porch and felt mostly the strange light relief of a draft finally stopped. The marriage had never been the thing she crossed the country for. The man riding away had never written her a word. What saved the ranch was not a hidden fortune. There was no buried treasure in the Vance place, only a tin of careful savings and a great deal of work. What saved it was Caleb's money and Caleb's hands, and a county full of plain neighbors who turned out to be paying closer attention than Hannah ever knew. Sue Tatum brought her own deceased husband's stock notes and co-signed against the Dunmore debt. Old Pruitt worked through the spring for wages Hannah could barely pay, and never once mentioned it. Reverend Hollis quietly let it be known in Lodgepole that the cattleman Dunmore had pressured a young woman alone, and Dunmore, who valued his standing more than one small foreclosure, found a reason to extend the note. By the time the grass came green into the valley, the fence ran straight. The cattle grazed sound, and the timber house stood paid down and steady, saved not by a miracle, but by the quiet, daily, unglamorous worth of the people the town had read right past. And Caleb. Caleb stayed in the bunkhouse and asked for nothing, because that was the only way he knew how to love a woman he'd handed to his brother. He did not come to the house in the evenings now any more than he had before. He filled the wood box and mended the fence and tipped his hat when their paths crossed in the yard. And he held himself a careful arm's length from her, a man keeping his distance from a fire he had decided he had no business warming at. As if now that she knew, the staying away had to be even more exact than before. The dust of that distance lay between them all spring, a gap of plain courtesy that neither of them would be the first to step across. And Hannah came to understand that he would go on like that until the day they buried him, asking nothing, taking nothing, keeping her warm from 8 feet off, unless somebody made him stop. It was Hannah who had to cross the yard. It was Hannah who stood in the bunkhouse doorway one warm spring evening and told him she had married the wrong brother on the strength of the right one's heart, and that she did not intend to spend the rest of her life 8 feet from the only honest man who'd ever written her name. She did not ask him to court her. She had a year of his courtship already, folded soft in a tin. She only asked him, plain as he'd taught her to be, whether he was ready to say out loud the things he'd only ever said on paper. Caleb Vance took a long breath, the kind a man takes before he sets down a weight he's carried 4 years. And he said yes, quiet and complete and right on time at last. They married in the fall, in the same little whitewashed church, with Reverend Hollis reading the words and Sue Tatum crying openly in the second pew, and old Pruitt standing up straight for once. This time, the quiet brother stood at the front. This time, there was no other man on the platform. And Hannah did not wear a wedding too loud or a grin too easy. She wore a thin gold locket and the steadiness of a woman who finally knew exactly whose words she'd believed and who had been right to believe them all along. In the years that came after, when the children Royce had only ever talked about were real and underfoot, Hannah kept the unsent letter where she could reach it. She did not burn it. On the evenings when the light went honey gold over the valley the way it had the day she stepped off the train, she would take it from the tin and unfold it once and read the plain, careful hand of the man now asleep in her own house. And then she would fold it small again and slip it into her pocket, warm against her, and go out to him on the porch where the first stars were coming. She had crossed 2 territories for a voice on a page. It had taken her 4 winters, a lost marriage, and a board pried up off a cold floor to learn that the voice had been telling her the truth the whole time. It had only been wearing the wrong name. Some men say it loud and mean none of it. Others write it once, fold it small, and wait 4 years for you to find the words. If you'd been Hannah standing in that cold bunk room with the proof in your hands, would you have walked away from the marriage you'd crossed a country to keep the way she did? Or would you have folded the letter back under the board and tried to love the man whose name you already wore? Tell me below. And if a story about a quiet love that waited without ever once asking to be repaid stayed with you tonight. There's another one about the people this world reads wrong in the first minute, and it's right here.